Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Eidan, and I'm an advisor and solution architect at the Bank for International Settlements in our innovation office in Hong Kong. I'm here to talk to you quickly today about central bank digital currencies, provide a global perspective, and some updates on our recent work. All right, let's get started. So on the agenda for today, we'll talk quickly about what is CBDC and try to give some fundamental definitions. I'll try to motivate the why CBDC and why everybody's talking about it, and probably why you're having me at this conference. I'll talk a little bit about retail CBDC, a little bit about wholesale CBDC, and then finally I'll come to international multi-CBDC arrangements. And then last but not least, I'll give a quick overview of the BIS Innovation Hub and try to highlight some of our work and hopefully interest you to get involved a little bit more. So what is CBDC? I like to start from this diagram. I think that this kind of tells all the fundamentals. You'll see this diagram is an intersection of four main attributes that we think of as the taxonomy of money. Reading from left to right, from the red oval, the first one is the notion of universal accessibility. The next one is the notion of it being an electronic instrument. In the blue oval, you can see whether or not the instrument is issued by a central bank. And then lastly, in the yellow oval, you'll see whether transacting with this is a peer-to-peer function. So for example, if you look at universally accessible, if you look at the intersection of universally accessible, central bank issued, and peer-to-peer, you'll see cash as a familiar instrument of payment. Looking just up and to the right from there, you'll see CBDC, or here called CBCC, central bank cryptocurrency. You'll see retail CBDC sitting at the intersection of all of these ovals. In other words, it is universally accessible, electronic, central bank issued, and peer-to-peer. And just to the right of that, you'll see wholesale CBDC, and we'll talk about the distinction between those in a little bit when we talk about motivations and some of the work that we're doing with these different verticals. Wholesale CBDC is not universally accessible, but it is electronic, it is central bank issued, and it is peer-to-peer. So when you think about CBDC, I'd encourage you to think about the attributes of money and where CBDC lies relative to other instruments like cash, cryptocurrency, commodity money, and maybe bank deposits and mobile money that you can see in the top left corner, where they're universally accessible, electronic, but not central bank issued and not peer-to-peer instruments. You'll see the link to this is a paper called Central Bank Cryptocurrencies, dated back to September 2017. So we've been thinking about this for quite some time. Why CBDC? So let's talk quickly about some brief motivators. Really, the answer for why CBDC is very much dependent on the region that we're talking about. And we're also dependent on the instrument. If we look at this graph and we just read around the edges, you'll see that a lot of central banks are thinking about CBDC for the following reasons. So maybe reading from the top clockwise. So payment safety and robustness of payment infrastructure, efficiencies in payments, both in a domestic context and in a cross-border context, a general mandate of financial stability that central banks have within their own jurisdictions, the implementation of monetary policy, and last but not least, the notion of financial inclusion. So these are all, there are many more elements to why central bank digital currencies. Some of them are also external elements, like the growing increase of big tech, stablecoins, cryptocurrencies, and the like. But when we think about why central banks are engaged with central bank digital currencies, these 6 reasons float up to the top. Again, you'll find a link to this in the slides. This is a good map that shows a global overview of how many central banks are working on this. I believe the statistic is that 86% of central banks are in the design phases, piloting, doing proofs of concepts, or even taking things into pilots and productions. This is a good kind of overview of what the landscape looks like now, and this type of map gets updated almost every quarter as the globe lights up with more and more central banks working on these type of projects. Before I move on, it's probably worthwhile noting that live projects are still far and few between. So this is a complicated endeavor, with many risks. So central banks are proceeding with caution, but nonetheless very, very engaged. Talking about some retail CBDC, I think, and giving maybe a quick overview of some of our thinking around this, I think the first thing maybe to note is the ratio of retail CBDC in circulation versus bank deposits. And what this means is when we think about retail CBDC, many people tend to think about the cash that they have in their hand. And I think it's important. This gives a quick snapshot of different countries and what their balance is between bank deposits. So that's money, retail money that sits within the bank, versus cash in circulation. So that would be the equivalent of the cash that you have in your hand. And as we work on retail CBDCs, one of the main things that we're looking at is how these ratios may change. You can read more about this in the paper linked below. CBDC, the quest for minimally invasive technology, that was just recently published in June of this year. There's three main models that we're looking at for retail CBDC. Reading from top to bottom, the first one is called direct CBDC. Then you have a notion of hybrid CBDC, and then you have a notion of intermediated CBDC. The two distinctions that we make here are what the liability represents and what the operational relationship between the entities represents. So you can see on the left side of each one of these diagrams, you have the central bank with its balance sheet, and on the right-hand side of the diagram, you have a customer like you and I and a merchant. The yellow line represents the liability of the instrument. So whether or not when you hold a cash when you hold a piece of cash, that represents a liability of the central bank. When you hold a bank deposit, that represents a liability against the bank, not against the central bank. So, and then the blue line represents. The blue line represents the liability, and the yellow line represents the operational relationship. So what you'll see in the direct CBDC is that both the blue line and the yellow line represent go directly between the holder of the asset, the holder of the CBDC, and the central bank itself. When you go down into the hybrid CBDC, what you'll notice is that the blue line goes straight through. We introduced this notion of payment service providers. Okay, and so the central bank, the liability goes straight through from the merchant into the central bank, but the operational relationship sits on the payment service providers, meaning that the ones that actually facilitate the movement of money between the end users is done by what's called PSPs, payment service providers. Alternatively, if we go, and I think the important thing to notice where there's the magnifying glass in the hybrid model is that the central bank records retail balances as well. So in this case, the central bank knows what balance user A has and what balance user B has, and so on and so forth. In the fully intermediated model that you see down at the bottom, the relationship is almost the same, with the distinction that the payment service providers can actually move money in between themselves, and the central bank on its liability side within the magnifying glass doesn't know the actual holdings of the holders of the currency. So even though those holders of the currency have that direct blue line from them back to the central bank, so they hold a central bank liability, there's a obfuscation of what the actual positions are, meaning that the central bank only knows the positions of the payment service providers, but the payment service providers in turn know the positions of the end users. There's different balances to each one of these three models. At the moment, it looks like there's a lot of work being done between the second two models as opposed to the direct CBDC. I think the operational burden on central banks with direct CBDCs in most economies seems to be something that isn't quite desirable at the moment. So that's a quick overview of some models and some ways of thinking about retail CBDC and some of the trade-offs between different design decisions. Moving on to wholesale CBDC. Wholesale CBDC, again, as a reminder, is a CBDC that isn't generally available to retail clients, and it's primarily used as an interbank system. So if anyone's familiar with RTGS, real-time gross settlement systems for interbank payments. That's what wholesale CBDCs primarily look at. This image is an image from Jasper Phase 3, a project that was run in Canada between Payments Canada, the Bank of Canada, and the Toronto Montreal Stock Exchange. And most domestic wholesale CBDCs look something like this. What you can see in the middle is an issuer. The issuer is connected to a subset of banks that ultimately are called Tier 1 banks that have access to the central bank balance sheet. And you can see that these central banks will use wholesale CBDC to settle payments between them. And generally, they settle payments between them either primarily for securities and for outstanding balances at the end of the day. So a quick snapshot of wholesale CBDCs, you can think of wholesale CBDCs as an alternative for high value payments within a domestic context. Quickly switching over and extending a wholesale CBDC to international multi-CBDCs, which really is taking a group of wholesale CBDCs and a group of domestic wholesale CBDCs and reasoning about how these things can connect to each other, brings us to the topic of international multi-CBDC arrangements. And this is where things start to get really interesting. So international MCBDC for short, it really starts talking about cross-border payments and all the complexities of cross-border payments. On the left, you can see a schematic diagram of what a correspondent banking model would look like between 4 different jurisdictions. So the circles at the edges are banks that sit within these jurisdictions, and the circles in the middle are correspondent banks. And some of the pain points here are that transactions are generally costly, complex to operate, have a high FX costs, have settlement risks, have low transparency to the payee and payer, and ultimately have a heavy reporting burden for every single intermediary that touches the payment in the chain. On the right-hand side, you can see a breakdown of these costs. So nostro vostro liquidity, meaning the amount of money that you need to hold in each jurisdiction within something called nostro vostro accounts. Treasury operations, FX costs, compliance, the list goes on and on. But that's a kind of in-order breakdown of what the cost of cross-border transactions breaks down to. And it's probably worthwhile noting that the cost of cross-border transactions can be up to about 6% of each transaction. So not a small sum of money. This problem has drawn so much attention that it's very much the focal point of some of the G20 work. And the G20 proposed an agenda for enhancing cross-border payments that's made up of these 5 different sections. If we read from right to left, starting at point number A, so public-private sector commitment, regulatory and supervisory oversight, existing payment infrastructure arrangements, data and market practices, and then last but not least, new payment infrastructures and arrangements. And that's very much where CBDC plays a role, is within the context of evaluating new payment infrastructures that can solve this huge burden of global cross-border payments. So there's 3 models that we can briefly talk about that probably encapsulate our thinking around international MCBDCs. The first model takes 2 CBDC systems, so the system in blue and the system in red, and talks about privately offered correspondent clearing systems. So these would be private companies that maybe sit in each jurisdiction and provide clearing solutions between these 2 jurisdictions. The next model, Model 2, going clockwise from there, talks about MCBDC arrangements based on interlinking CBDC systems. So if you've heard the term interoperability before, or meaning the ability to interoperate, to connect technically between 2 completely different clearing and settling and payment systems. This is a technical interface, so it's not necessarily a private company sitting in between and clearing, more rather kind of technical protocols. These could be centralized protocols or decentralized protocols. That is very much Model 2. So you can think about it as every domestic region or every economic zone having their own type of wholesale or retail CBDC, and technical interfaces that ultimately bilaterally connect between these systems. Last but not least, Model 3 is the simplest, and Model 3 talks about a single rulebook, a single governance arrangement, a single ledger, so to speak, where you can pay and settle cross-border CBDC currencies. So this is probably a good place to introduce the Innovation Hub and some of the work that we're doing. So maybe quickly, I'll just call out the goal of the Innovation Hub, and I'll only read the words that are highlighted in that are bold. So the first one is that we identify critical trends in technology that are relevant to central banks. We develop public goods within those trends that we identify, and we run a network of central bank experts on innovative topics. The three centers that are fully operational are currently in Switzerland, in Singapore, and in Hong Kong, where I'm calling from. You can see these in the columns and on this graph. And the 6 areas that we operate in are supervisory and regulatory technology, next generation financial market infrastructures, CBDC, as we discussed, and you can see CBDC is the busiest row across this chart. Open finance, cybersecurity, and green finance. And you can see the color coding here corresponds to where we are in those projects. A quick overview of the map. So you can probably see the locations that I called out. You can see that the location markers in red are existing hubs. The location markers in blue are new hub centers that are popping up right now. The ones in purple are strategic partnerships, and then the ones in brown and kind of not filled in are working group chairs. So, for example, green finance is chaired out of London, cybersecurity is chaired out of Israel, and SupTech and RegTech is chaired out of Australia. Maybe a quick shout out to some of our recent work. So we've recently issued a series of reports on CBDC that I would encourage anybody interested in the topic to go learn. It's a group of 7 central banks along with the BIS Innovation Hub, ECB, Bank of Japan, Riksbank, Swiss National Bank, Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and as I said, the BIS. That's an overview of primarily retail CBDCs and a very structured way of reasoning about trade-offs, both technical, governance, and policy. Project Helvetia is a project that came out recently out of our Swiss center, focusing on settling tokenized assets and central bank money, linking between the Swiss National Bank and the Swiss Digital Exchange, which is now getting pulled into a Banque de France project called Project Jura. Project Inthenon Line Rock to Mbridge is the most recent report out of the Hong Kong Center. This project is a multi-CBDC platform for settling international payments. That's between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, the People's Bank of China, and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. And last but not least, the last one that I would like to highlight is a project called Project Nexus, which is a blueprint for instant cross-border payments coming out of the center in Singapore with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And this is a project about connecting retail faster payments to each other, which is a potential alternative or augment to CBDC arrangements. I had one last slide that ran away here, but I'll just end with this. Apologies for that. So this is a quick snapshot of our team, and I'll end with a quote from Benoit Correa, the head of the BIS Innovation Hubs network, that he gave in September 10th in a recent speech. CBDC's goal is ultimately to preserve the best elements of our current system while still allowing a safe space for tomorrow's innovation. To do so, central banks have to act while the current system is still in place, and to act now. That's it. I left a link at the bottom if anybody wants to check out more of our work. Please reach out if you do. Thanks for having me, and I hope I didn't run too long. Thank you so much.